Jacob Riker tapped his boots against the metallic floor of Stellar Unity, the intergalactic military ship he now called home. He had barely adjusted to the rigid schedules and endless maintenance tasks when he received the order. It wasn't an ordinary directive, either. It required him to share his quarters with a HFY warrior. Of all the crew, why me? He muttered under his breath, clutching the tablet displaying the new arrangement. He had heard stories about the HFY. Tall, powerful aliens with sharp, angular features and a reputation for strict discipline. They were respected warriors, but their temperaments didn't exactly scream ideal roommate. When the door to his quarters slid open, Jacob found himself face to face with Tirana. She was everything he had imagined and more. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, her frame was a blend of muscle and grace. Her piercing amber eyes scanned the room like a battlefield, and her dark, scaled skin shimmered faintly under the fluorescent lights. "You are Jacob Riker?" she asked, her voice firm and commanding. Yeah, that's me," Jacob replied, his voice cracking slightly. He straightened his posture, trying to appear less intimidated. "I am Tirana of the HFY Vanguard. I have been assigned to these quarters. I expect discipline and order." She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her movements precise and deliberate. Jacob sighed inwardly. This was going to be a challenge. The first few minutes were silent, with Jacob pretending to focus on his tablet while Tirana methodically unpacked her belongings. Her equipment was a stark contrast to Jacob's cluttered desk, filled with tools, wires, and half-finished gadgets. She placed her weapons and armor in a perfectly aligned row, each piece gleaming as if freshly polished. "You live in chaos," Tirana remarked, her tone neutral but sharp enough to make Jacob glance at his desk. "It's organized chaos," he defended. "I know where everything is, mostly." Tirana arched an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. "On a ship like this, discipline is survival. Sloppiness is weakness." Jacob bit back a retort. He knew arguing with her wasn't going to help. Instead, he decided to change the subject. "So, why are you here? I thought the HFY had their own ships." Tirana's jaw tightened slightly. "A diplomatic agreement. Our presence here is to foster cooperation between our species. I am here to observe and assist. Nothing more." "Great," Jacob muttered under his breath. "A warrior babysitter." Tirana's sharp hearing caught his words. Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. The awkward silence stretched on until the ship's intercom crackled to life. "Attention, crew. All personnel to their stations. Routine maintenance checks are commencing." "That's my cue," Jacob said, grabbing his toolkit. He hesitated for a moment, then looked back at Tirana. "Do you need anything? Like instructions on how things work here?" Tirana's gaze was steady. "I am capable of adapting." "Of course you are," Jacob mumbled, heading out the door. As he worked on repairing a faulty power conduit, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that Tirana was going to make his life difficult. It wasn't just her intimidating presence, it was the way she carried herself, like she was above the humans on the ship. He had dealt with plenty of strong personalities before, but Tirana was a different challenge altogether. Back in the quarters, Tirana sat on her bunk, studying the room. It was smaller than she was used to, and the humans' disorganized belongings grated on her nerves. But she had faced worse conditions in battle. If living with this Jacob Riker was what her mission required, she would endure it. Her thoughts were interrupted when Jacob returned, a smudge of grease on his cheek and a faint look of annoyance on his face. "Rough day?" she asked, surprising him with the question. "Not the worst," Jacob replied, dropping his toolkit on the desk. "Just a few loose connections and a stubborn conduit." Tirana nodded, noting his competence despite his apparent lack of discipline. "You are skilled in your work." Jacob blinked, not expecting the compliment. Thanks. You're the first person to say that without adding, but you're a mess." "There is truth in both statements," Tirana replied with a faint smirk, which caught Jacob off guard. He chuckled, shaking his head. You, iCash, really don't sugarcoat anything, do you? Honesty is strength, Tirana said firmly. Jacob sat down, still laughing softly. For the first time, he thought maybe, just maybe, this arrangement wouldn't be a total disaster. But then, the intercom buzzed again, this time with a more urgent tone. Attention, crew. We've detected an unidentified vessel on our radar. All personnel to alert status. Jacob and Tirana exchanged a glance, their earlier tension momentarily forgotten. Whatever differences they had, they were about to face something much bigger together. The next few days aboard Stellar Unity were filled with tension, as Jacob and Tirana tried to navigate their new living arrangement. Sharing a small room with someone from a completely different species wasn't going to be easy. Jacob tried to make the best of it. He kept his usual routine of tinkering with various ship components, but now he had to work around Tirana's strict presence. The Lycash warrior was up before him every morning, performing a series of physical exercises that involved stretching, running in place, and complex moves that made her appear like a warrior preparing for battle. The sound of her movements in the small room was hard to ignore. Jacob, on the other hand, was more laid back. He worked long hours on repairs, but didn't wake up until the last minute, preferring to skip most of the physical exercises. He quickly realized that this didn't sit well with Tirana. "Your body is weak," she remarked one morning as she finished a set of push-ups. Jacob shot her an amused glance, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's not weak, just efficient. You should try relaxing more." Tirana didn't respond, but Jacob noticed her eyes narrowing slightly, as if considering his words. That evening, she challenged him to a physical contest. "You believe you are strong?" she asked, her tone flat. "Prove it." Jacob raised an eyebrow, unsure whether she was serious. "What kind of contest?" "We will race," she said. "From here to the engine room and back. I will give you a 10-second head start." Jacob laughed. "You think you can beat me? I'm an engineer, not a runner." "Do you fear losing?" Tirana asked, her voice cool and unwavering. Jacob hesitated for a moment. He could tell this was more than just a friendly challenge. It was about pride. "Fine. I'll take you on." The race was set. When the starting signal came, Jacob sprinted down the long corridor, giving it everything he had. He could hear Tirana's heavy footsteps close behind, each one echoing louder than his own. 10 seconds felt like an eternity. But just as he rounded the corner to the engine room, he heard a thundering crash. Tirana had caught up. She was faster than he had ever expected. With ease, she passed him, reaching the engine room in half the time it took him. "Not bad for a human," Tirana said, breathing lightly as she waited for him to catch up. Jacob was out of breath, his pride bruised. "Okay, you win. But next time, I pick the challenge." Tirana looked down at him with a glimmer of amusement in her eyes. "We will see." As the days wore on, it became clear that their differences weren't just physical. The way they approached life, their work, and even the smallest tasks was worlds apart. Jacob's style of engineering was focused on problem-solving and thinking outside the box. He often found creative solutions to problems, but Tirana's approach was all about following the rules and maintaining strict control. If Jacob made a mistake, he'd improvise. Tirana, however, would stop everything to ensure that every move was calculated and perfect. One afternoon, while working on an advanced diagnostic system, Jacob accidentally overloaded the circuit. Sparks flew, and the system shut down. "You are reckless," Tirana said immediately, her voice hard. "I know what I'm doing," Jacob replied, frustrated. "I just need to try again." Tirana crossed her arms. "You should not try again. You should do it properly the first time. The cost of failure is too high." Jacob glared at her. "And the cost of overthinking it is time wasted. You can't control everything." The tension between them was growing. Their styles weren't just different, they were in direct conflict. Jacob could feel himself growing more irritated by Tirana's constant critiques. She seemed to think he was reckless, while he felt she was too rigid. But then, something unexpected happened. After another argument, Tirana quietly walked over to the console and started working on the diagnostic system. Jacob watched her for a moment, curious. To his surprise, Tirana didn't follow the strict procedures. She made quick, calculated adjustments, then typed in a few commands. Within minutes, the system was back online. Jacob blinked. "I thought you were all about following the rules." Tirana gave him a rare, small smile. "Sometimes, the rules must be bent to achieve the desired result." Jacob didn't know how to respond. He was used to the idea that rules were meant to be followed, but Tirana's actions had proven him wrong. Later that evening, after another tense day of working side by side, Tirana spoke to Jacob in a more thoughtful tone. "You are not like I expected," she said. "You are creative. I respect that." Jacob nodded slowly. "And you're not as rigid as I thought either. You have your moments." There was a long pause before Tirana spoke again. "We are different, but perhaps we are not so different after all." Jacob smiled, feeling a glimmer of hope. Maybe this arrangement wouldn't be so bad after all. As they stood in their quarters, the hum of the ship surrounding them, Jacob couldn't help but wonder what the future would hold for them. They were two people from vastly different worlds, yet in this confined space, they were starting to find common ground. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Days aboard Stellar Unity continued to pass with the uneasy truce between Jacob and Tirana. Despite their differences, the two of them began to adapt to the new arrangement. Jacob kept to his work, maintaining and repairing systems around the ship, while Tirana observed and trained in her warrior discipline. It wasn't until the ship encountered a series of technical malfunctions that their reluctant partnership truly began to form. The first problem arose late one night when the gravity control system malfunctioned. The ship's gravity fields fluctuated wildly, causing objects to float unpredictably, and some crew members to lose their balance. Jacob was the first to receive the distress call. He grabbed his toolkit and rushed toward the control center. Tirana, as always, was right behind him. "Stay back," Jacob said, noticing her approaching. "I got this." Tirana didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed a nearby console and began assessing the issue herself. Jacob didn't have time to argue. The gravity fields were becoming more erratic, and the entire ship was starting to feel the effects. Jacob quickly started adjusting the power relay for the gravity systems, but he was having no luck. The core was overloading, and it would only be a matter of time before things became much worse. "We need to cut off power to the core," Jacob shouted. "It's the only way to reset the system." Tirana didn't hesitate. Without a word, she dashed over to a nearby terminal and quickly accessed the ship's control grid. Her fingers flew across the keys with a precision Jacob could barely keep up with. "I've located the shoot-off valve," Tirana said, her voice steady. "On your mark." Jacob gave a quick nod, stepping back. Together, they both engaged the switch at the same time. Instantly, the power to the core cut off, and the gravity systems stabilized. Jacob let out a sigh of relief, wiping his forehead. "Nice work." Tirana didn't react to the praise. Instead, she simply studied the console again, making sure the system was fully restored. "We work well together." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, I guess we do." Tirana's expression softened slightly, though it was hard to tell if she was pleased or just focused on the task. Still, Jacob couldn't help but feel a little proud of their teamwork. Later that evening, when the ship had returned to normal, the two of them were assigned to another repair. This time, it was the auxiliary engines. Jacob was taking the lead, as usual, but this time Tirana didn't simply stand by and watch. "Need a hand?" she asked, her arms crossed as she surveyed the engine. Jacob hesitated, unsure whether she would actually be helpful, but something about the way she looked at the engine made him reconsider. Maybe her skills weren't just about her physical strength. She had a keen eye for detail. "Sure," Jacob replied, stepping aside to make room for her. "You can take the lead this time. I could use some fresh eyes on this." Tirana didn't say anything. She simply moved forward, her movements sharp and deliberate. Jacob watched as she worked, surprised by her efficiency. Every part was carefully examined, each component checked with precision. Her experience as a warrior clearly had its advantages. For the first time, Jacob realized how much he had underestimated her. Tirana wasn't just a soldier. She was a highly skilled tactician, able to adapt to any situation. Her mind was as sharp as her combat skills. "I see what you're doing," Jacob said, admiring her work. "You're looking for any weak points in the system. If we miss one small detail, it could cause a serious problem later." Tirana gave a brief nod. "Precisely." Jacob's respect for her grew, and for the first time, he felt like they were truly becoming a team. They were still very different, but they were learning from each other. That evening, as they sat together in their quarters for a rare break, Jacob found himself thinking about their relationship. It was still awkward, still full of tension at times, but it was also beginning to feel less like a forced arrangement and more like a partnership. "So," Jacob said, taking a seat across from Tirana, "you were a warrior before you were assigned here, right?" Tirana looked up, her amber eyes focused on him. "Yes, I fought in the Great Campaign. I have led many battles." Jacob nodded slowly. "That's impressive, but you don't seem like the typical soldier. You're not all about fighting." "I am a warrior," Tirana said simply. "But I am more than just that. A true warrior must understand both the blade and the mind. There is strength in wisdom, not just in power." Jacob smiled. "I think you and I would get along much better if you weren't so serious all the time." Tirana raised an eyebrow, but there was a flicker of amusement in her gaze. "I have my moments." "Yeah, I've seen them," Jacob replied, grinning. "You're not just a fighter. You're a lot more than that." "I suppose I am learning that about you as well," Tirana said. The two of them sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the ship surrounding them. The tension between them wasn't completely gone, but it was beginning to feel less like a wall and more like something they could work around. They weren't quite friends, but they were starting to understand each other better. As they prepared for their next assignment, Jacob couldn't help but wonder what other challenges they would face together, and what else they might learn from each other along the way. The days aboard Stellar Unity continued to pass, and while Jacob and Tirana had begun to work together more smoothly, there were still moments of tension between them. Though the gravity system was fixed and the auxiliary engines had been successfully repaired, the atmosphere in their quarters remained uneasy. They were beginning to understand each other's strengths and weaknesses, but their differences were still glaring. Jacob's mind worked best when he had time to think through a problem, often experimenting with unconventional methods to find a solution. Tirana, however, was meticulous, believing in careful planning and precision. Their approaches sometimes clashed, especially when time was tight. One afternoon, the ship's communications system malfunctioned. The main relay was down, and the crew needed it fixed quickly to avoid communication failure during an upcoming mission. Jacob was immediately assigned to the task, but Tirana insisted on accompanying him. "I'll help," she said, her tone firm. Jacob hesitated. "I can handle it." Tirana stood her ground. "We will finish faster together. You will work faster with my help." Despite his reservations, Jacob knew she was right. The problem needed to be fixed quickly, and they didn't have time for his usual solo approach. The two of them made their way to the communications hub, where the relay was located. As they approached the room, Jacob could feel the tension rise again. He knew they were both capable, but when they worked together, it often felt like they were trying to outdo each other. Inside the communications hub, Jacob immediately began inspecting the relay's wiring, trying to find the source of the problem. Tirana, however, moved to the console without asking, starting to run diagnostic tests. Hey, I was looking at that, Jacob said, a little annoyed. Tirana didn't respond, her attention entirely focused on the data on the screen. The relay's primary signal has been severed. It will take a few minutes to reroute the power to the backup system. Jacob stood behind her, crossing his arms. I was going to do that. You just don't give me space. Tirana finally turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. We need to work quickly. If you want to waste time, you can do it elsewhere. Jacob bit his lip, trying to stay calm. He knew she was right. Time was running out, and they needed to act fast. He couldn't afford to get angry over something so small. All right, fine. Let's just get this over with, he muttered. Together, they worked in silence for several minutes, Jacob adjusting the wiring while Tirana rerouted the power. The tension between them was palpable, but there was no time to argue. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the system came online. The communication relay was functioning again. Jacob stood up, wiping his hands on his jumpsuit. Well, that was quick. Tirana, for the first time, gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. You did well. Your approach was effective. Jacob was surprised. He hadn't expected praise, especially from someone as critical as Tirana. Thanks. You were helpful too. She raised an eyebrow. It's my job to help. I expect no thanks. Jacob chuckled, the tension in the room easing a little. Well, I'm still going to thank you. I don't mind a little cooperation every now and then. As they left the communications hub, Jacob couldn't help but feel like they were slowly beginning to understand each other. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when they got under each other's skin, but there were also moments of true collaboration. Later that day, as they sat in their quarters for a brief break, the silence between them felt less awkward. Jacob decided to break it. Hey, Tirana, why did you join the Ikash military? You've said you were a warrior, but I don't know much about why you became one. Tirana seemed to consider the question for a moment. I was born into a family of warriors. My ancestors fought in the Great Campaign, a battle for our people's survival. My father, my mother, both served. It is our way. Jacob nodded slowly, trying to understand. That sounds intense, but it's not just about fighting, is it? I mean, you've got a lot more going on than just being a warrior. Tirana was silent for a long moment before she spoke again. You are correct. To be a warrior is not only to fight but to protect. My people value honor and sacrifice. Every battle we fought was for something greater than ourselves. Jacob could see the weight of her words in her eyes. It was clear that her past was more complicated than just being a soldier. She had seen things, done things, that had shaped her into the person she was now. Sounds like you carry a lot with you, Jacob said softly. I can't even imagine what that must be like. Tirana's expression softened just a fraction. It is what it is. I fight not for glory, but for my people. For the future. Jacob nodded, respect in his eyes. I get that. We're not so different, you and I. We both do what we have to do for those we care about. The silence that followed was comfortable. It was as though, for the first time, they were on the same page, understanding each other, not just as strangers or enemies, but as allies. As they sat in the quiet of their shared quarters, Jacob realized that this partnership, this unlikely alliance, was beginning to take root. It wasn't always easy, but maybe, just maybe, it could work. The days aboard Stellar Unity had become somewhat routine. Jacob and Tirana were no longer at constant odds, though their interactions still carried an air of professionalism. They worked well together, tackling problems with a mix of Jacob's creative solutions and Tirana's disciplined approach. It wasn't perfect, but it was becoming something that Jacob could rely on. However, that peace was shattered one fateful afternoon when a distress signal cut through the ship's communications. The Stellar Unity had entered an uncharted sector of space, and a small vessel had been attacked by hostile forces. The message was brief, but it was clear. They were in danger. Jacob and Tirana were summoned to the ship's briefing room, where the captain gave them the details. "A pirate ship is near," Captain Miles said, his expression tense. "The vessel we've just received a distress signal from is unarmed. We're the nearest ship, and we need to respond quickly to ensure the safety of the crew." Jacob's stomach tightened. Space pirates weren't something he had ever dealt with, and the idea of facing them now, with little to no preparation, didn't sit well with him. But there was no time for hesitation. "Are we equipped for a fight?" Jacob asked, his voice steady despite the knot in his chest. Tarana glanced at him, her amber eyes sharp. "We are not soldiers," she said, "but we are capable." Captain Miles nodded. "Exactly. This is a rescue mission, not a battle. We're going to intercept their ship, offer assistance, and get out as quickly as possible. Jacob, you'll be handling the ship's systems. Tarana, you'll accompany the rescue team. We'll need you to ensure the safety of the crew while we assist." Jacob felt his palms start to sweat. The last thing he wanted to do was be stuck behind a console while Tarana faced the pirates head-on. But he knew she was right. They had to focus on the task at hand. The Stellar Unity engaged its engines and sped toward the coordinates of the distressed ship. The crew moved quickly, preparing for the mission. Tarana, her eyes cold and focused, suited up in her combat gear, ready for anything. As they approached the disabled vessel, Jacob's heart pounded. The pirate ship loomed nearby, its dark silhouette a stark contrast against the stars. "We have to disable their weapons before we get any closer," Jacob said, his mind racing. "Otherwise, we'll be sitting ducks." Tarana looked over at him and nodded. "I'll take care of that. You focus on keeping our systems in working order." Jacob swallowed hard. He wasn't exactly thrilled by the idea of relying on Tarana for their safety, but he trusted her more than he cared to admit. With the ship closing in on the pirate vessel, Jacob quickly began hacking into the Stellar Unity systems, preparing to disrupt the pirate ship's weapon systems. He worked fast, his fingers flying over the console as he initiated a series of override protocols. On the other side of the ship, Tarana was already in the airlock, waiting for the doors to open. The moment they did, she stepped out, her warrior instincts kicking in as she assessed the situation. The pirate ship was heavily damaged, but its crew was still active, moving around on the main deck. Tarana's eyes narrowed. She was ready for a fight, but she hoped it wouldn't come to that. "Stay alert," she murmured to herself as she moved forward. Inside the ship, Jacob was working frantically, his fingers racing to keep up with the code he was writing to disrupt the enemy systems. He could feel the sweat trickling down his neck. If they didn't disable the pirates' weapons in time, they'd be in a world of trouble. "Almost there," Jacob muttered under his breath, staring at the screen. Meanwhile, Tarana was inside the pirate ship, quietly making her way toward the crew. Her presence was barely detectable as she moved through the dark hallways. Every step was calculated, every sound she made muffled by her training. She could see the pirates now, several of them gathered around a control panel, unaware of her approach. Tarana unsheathed her blade, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The pirates were unaware of the danger approaching them. Just as Tarana was about to strike, the voice of Jacob came through the comms. "Got it," he shouted. "Their weapons are offline. You're clear to proceed." Tarana hesitated for a split second, wondering if she could handle the situation without bloodshed. But as the pirates turned toward the sound of her footsteps, she made her decision. She moved fast, striking the first pirate with a powerful blow that sent him flying backward. The others reacted quickly, pulling out weapons, but Tarana was faster. She disabled their guns with swift, efficient moves, knocking them out without killing them. "Jacob," she said into her comms, her voice cold. "The ship is secured. We have them contained." Jacob sighed in relief. "Good work. Get the crew back to the Stellar Unity. We're not out of the woods yet." Tarana turned toward the distressed crew of the attacked ship, who were huddled in a corner, clearly shaken but alive. She nodded to them, signaling that they could go. With the pirates subdued and the crew safe, they all returned to the stellar unity. Jacob could finally breathe again, but he knew they hadn't seen the last of the pirates. As Tirana returned to the bridge, Jacob couldn't help but feel a new respect for her. He'd seen her fight before, but today had been different. She was calm, focused, and efficient. "Nice job out there," Jacob said, giving her a brief smile. Tirana's eyes softened slightly. "It was nothing. We both did our part." It wasn't much, but for the first time, Jacob felt like they were more than just coworkers. Maybe, just maybe, they were starting to understand each other in a way that could make them true allies. After the pirate encounter, life aboard the stellar unity had settled into a strange kind of rhythm. Jacob and Tirana continued their work together, their relationship evolving from a partnership of necessity to one of understanding. Though they were very different, their skills complemented each other. Jacob's technical ingenuity and Tirana's strength and discipline made them a surprisingly effective team. But even as the days passed, the tension between them didn't fully disappear. Jacob still couldn't shake the feeling that Tirana was always on edge, like a coiled spring, ready to snap at any moment. He knew that her past as a warrior weighed heavily on her, but there were still many things left unsaid between them. One evening, after a long day of repairs, Jacob found himself sitting at the small dining table in their shared quarters. Tirana was across from him, scanning a datapad. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't exactly friendly either. They both had their own thoughts, their own worlds they retreated to. Finally, Jacob broke the quiet. "Tirana, I've been meaning to ask you something." He hesitated, unsure of how to phrase it. "You've been through a lot, haven't you? I mean, back on your home world, with your family, your people." Tirana looked up from her datapad, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you asking?" "I'm just curious," Jacob said, his tone gentle. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but I can't help wondering. How did you end up in the military? What made you want to become a warrior?" Tirana's gaze softened for a moment, though her expression remained guarded. She put the datapad down, taking a deep breath before answering. "My family, my clan, they have a long history of service. We are warriors by tradition. It is an honor to fight for our people. I never thought of it as a choice, Jacob. It was simply what was expected of me." Jacob nodded slowly, trying to understand. "So you never had the chance to choose a different path?" "No," she replied quietly. "The military was my duty, my honor. There was no room for anything else." Jacob could hear the weight in her words. He knew there was more to the story than she was saying, but he also knew she wasn't ready to share it. Not yet. He decided not to push further, and instead, he changed the subject. "I get it. The whole duty and honor thing. I've had a lot of my own responsibilities too." He smiled slightly. "But for me, it's all about fixing things, making things better. You know, the human way." Tirana raised an eyebrow at him. "You fix things." Jacob grinned, feeling a bit more at ease now that the conversation had shifted. "Yeah. Back on Earth, I was always the one people called when something broke. Whether it was a ship, a machine, or a system. I was the one who could figure it out. It's just what I do." Tirana leaned back in her chair, her eyes thoughtful. "So you believe you can fix anything?" Jacob shrugged, not fully sure how to answer. "I mean, I fixed a lot of things, but I don't know if that means I can fix everything. Maybe just the stuff I understand." He paused, then added, "But I guess I can also fix relationships. In a way." Tirana didn't respond immediately, but her lips curled into the slightest of smiles. Jacob couldn't help but notice the change. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time, he saw a hint of something human in her, a glimpse of the person behind the warrior facade. "Maybe," she said softly, "you can fix things in ways I can't." Jacob didn't know how to reply to that. It was rare to hear Tirana admit to anything less than perfect confidence. He couldn't help but feel a bit of pride at the thought. Just then, the ship's AI alerted them to a malfunction in the environmental controls. Another routine issue. The problem wasn't serious, but it required both of their attention. They stood up and headed to the control room, where the issue was easy to identify. Once again, they fell into their usual rhythm. Jacob worked on the technical aspects of the system, while Tirana monitored the ship's surroundings, her sharp eyes keeping everything in check. Even though they were doing their usual work, something felt different this time. Jacob realized that the quiet understanding between them had deepened. They were no longer two strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were a team, whether they fully accepted it yet or not. After the issue was resolved, they stood in the control room, staring at the now functioning systems. "I guess we make a good team," Jacob said, trying to break the lingering tension. Tirana looked at him for a moment before answering, her voice steady. "We do, Jacob. We do." For the first time, Jacob felt like they were no longer just two soldiers on a mission. There was something more growing between them, an unspoken respect, an understanding. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something that neither of them expected. The days after the environmental control malfunction had passed quickly, but Jacob and Tirana both felt the shift between them. They had come a long way since their first awkward meeting, and while the ship was still their primary focus, something more had begun to grow, something neither had expected. The stellar Unity had entered a peaceful sector of space, where they could finally relax for a moment. The crew was taking a much-needed break, allowing time for personal tasks and recovery. Jacob found himself walking through the halls of the ship, his thoughts drifting back to Tirana. She had become a constant presence in his life, and despite their differences, there was something undeniably powerful about their shared experiences. He had spent most of the day in the ship's engine room, checking systems and running diagnostics. When he finally left, he decided to visit the observation deck. The view from there was breathtaking, stars stretching out endlessly, the vastness of space quiet and almost serene. He wasn't alone when he arrived. Tirana stood by the glass, her hands resting on the railing as she stared out into the stars. Her posture was relaxed, yet Jacob could see that she was lost in thought. He walked up beside her, feeling the usual tension in the air between them. But this time, it didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt like something was on the edge of being understood. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Jacob said, trying to break the silence. Tirana turned her head to him slightly, nodding. "Yes, we don't get to see this kind of beauty often in my world. It is peaceful here. I find that I like it." Jacob looked at her, surprised by the softness in her voice. "You're not the type to just relax, are you?" Tirana's lips twitched upward in a faint smile, the smallest sign of humor. "I don't remember the last time I had the luxury of resting." Jacob chuckled lightly. "I guess I'm used to being able to fix things, to do things. But I get it. Sometimes there's just nothing to fix. Sometimes all you can do is look." Tirana didn't respond immediately. Instead, she shifted her gaze back to the stars. After a long moment, she spoke again, her voice lower than usual. "Jacob, when I was chosen to serve on this mission, I did not expect to meet someone like you. Someone who looks for ways to fix things, even when it seems impossible." Jacob was surprised by her words. He had always thought of Tirana as someone who needed no fixing. She was strong, capable, and sure of herself. But now, hearing her speak this way, it made him realize that maybe they were more alike than he had thought. "I'm not perfect," he said quietly, unsure of how to express the thought. "But I think I've learned something from you, too. You're not just a warrior. You're more than that." Tirana finally turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "And what do you mean by that?" Jacob hesitated for a moment before answering. "You've taught me something about strength, about being calm and decisive, even when things are tough. I don't know if I could have handled some of the situations we've been through without your level-headedness." Tirana looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Thank you, Jacob. I have learned much from you as well. Your way of thinking. Your ability to look at things from a different perspective. You have your own strength." The silence that followed felt comfortable, a far cry from the awkward tension that had once filled their conversations. Jacob realized how much they had come to rely on each other in such a short amount of time. Before he could say anything else, Tirana spoke again, her voice softer than before. "Jacob, I've been thinking. We've spent a lot of time together, but we've never truly talked about our pasts, have we?" Jacob felt a shift in the air, a kind of vulnerability in her words. He had never asked her about her past, not because he didn't care, but because he could tell it was something she kept guarded. Still, he was curious. He knew there was much about Tirana he still didn't understand. "No, I guess we haven't," he replied. "I don't know much about your world or what you've been through." Tirana took a deep breath, as if preparing herself to share something deeply personal. "I was raised in a world where strength is the most valued trait. My people, we fight not because we want to, but because we must. We fight to protect, to survive. But survival comes at a cost. It cost me my family." Jacob's heart clenched. He could hear the pain in her words, the weight of loss that she carried with her. "I understand," Jacob said quietly, his voice steady. "I've lost people too. Not in the same way, but I know what it feels like to lose someone important." Tirana met his gaze, and for the first time, Jacob saw something different in her eyes. It wasn't the warrior he had come to know. It was a person, someone who had lived through pain and loss, just like him. "You are not alone, Jacob," she said softly. Jacob smiled, a feeling of warmth spreading through him. "Neither are you, Tirana." For a brief moment, they stood together, side by side, looking out at the stars. There was no need for words. They understood each other in a way that words could not express. In that moment, Jacob knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. They had become more than just allies. They had become friends, united by their experiences, their pain, and their shared strength. And maybe, just maybe, they would find a way to fix not just the problems they faced, but themselves as well.